The Apache-Sitgreaves National Forest is not a place that welcomes the fragile. It is a sprawling, rugged expanse in east-central Arizona, characterized by towering ponderosa pines, steep ridges, and an overwhelming, suffocating silence. In November 1975, the air here carried a biting chill, a promise of the brutal winter that was fast approaching. The forest was isolated, unforgiving, and ancient. For the logging crew contracted to thin the brush in the Turkey Springs area, it was just another worksite. But for one of them, it was about to become the threshold to an unimaginable nightmare. The crew consisted of 7 men, led by Mike Rogers. They were rough-hewn, hard-working guys in their 20s, accustomed to the grueling labor of wielding chainsaws from dawn until dusk. Among them was 22-year-old Travis Walton, a fit, athletic young man who was well-liked but known for having a bit of a rebellious streak. They were behind schedule on a federal contract, the pressure mounting with every passing day. On Wednesday, November 5th, they worked until the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature plummeting rapidly as the shadows lengthened across the forest floor. Exhausted and freezing, the 7 men piled into Mike Rogers' battered 1965 International Harvester pickup truck. The heater blasted warm air, offering a brief respite from the biting cold as they began the bone-jarring drive back to their homes in Snowflake, Arizona. The dirt road was treacherous, winding through dense stands of timber. The only light came from the truck's headlights, slicing through the enveloping darkness. The men were quiet, lost in their own thoughts. The drone of the engine and the crunch of tires on gravel the only sounds. Suddenly, the truck rounded a curve, and the atmosphere inside the cab shifted instantly. Through the trees on the right side of the road, a brilliant, unnatural glow spilled across the forest floor. It wasn't the warm, flickering light of a campfire, nor the harsh glare of a spotlight. It was an intense, yellowish-white luminescence that seemed to vibrate, casting strange, elongated shadows among the pines. The men fell silent, squinting through the dusty windshield. As the truck crept closer, the source of the light became terrifyingly clear. Hovering silently less than 100 feet off the road, suspended above a clearing of deadfall, was a massive metallic disc. It was nearly 20 feet across, glowing with an inner radiance that defied explanation. The surface appeared smooth, segmented by dark panels, and the entire structure hummed with a low, visceral vibration that the men could feel deep in their chests. It was a sound that didn't just reach their ears, it resonated in their bones. Panic erupted in the cab. "Stop the truck!" someone yelled. Mike Rogers slammed on the brakes, the heavy vehicle skidding to a halt on the loose gravel. Before anyone could process what they were looking at, the passenger door flew open. Travis Walton, driven by a mixture of shock, curiosity, and sheer adrenaline, leaped out of the truck. He didn't say a word. He just started walking briskly, purposefully, toward the glowing leviathan hovering in the trees. The other 6 men screamed at him to come back. "Travis, get back here! Are you crazy?" Mike yelled, his voice cracking with panic. But Travis didn't stop. He moved as if entranced, stepping over fallen logs and pushing through the underbrush. He reached the edge of the clearing, standing almost directly beneath the craft. He looked up, bathed in its unnatural, blinding light. The humming grew louder, escalating into a deafening, oscillating whine. Then, the unthinkable happened. From the underside of the craft, a beam of brilliant blue-green light shot downward. It struck Travis squarely in the chest with the force of a physical blow. The men in the truck watched in absolute horror as Travis was lifted into the air, his arms flailing, his body thrown backward in a violent, terrifying arc. He was suspended for a fraction of a second, a dark silhouette against the blinding light before he was hurled violently to the ground, landing with a sickening thud 10 feet away. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the frantic screams in the truck. "They got him! They got him!" Mike Rogers, consumed by blind, primal terror, slammed the truck into gear. He didn't wait to see if Travis was moving. He didn't wait to see what the craft would do next. He floored the accelerator, the tires spinning on the gravel, and tore off down the mountain road, leaving his friend lying motionless beneath the alien light. The drive down the mountain was a blur of panic and chaos. The men were hysterical, sobbing, shouting over each other. Mike drove recklessly, the truck fishtailing on the narrow, winding road. They were convinced they were being chased, constantly looking over their shoulders into the suffocating darkness. But as they put miles between themselves and the clearing, the sheer absurdity and horror of what they had just done began to sink in. They had left Travis. After a few miles, the panic began to subside, replaced by a crushing guilt. Mike pulled the truck over. The men sat in the dark, their breathing ragged, the silence of the forest pressing in on them. "We have to go back," Mike whispered. It took immense courage, but they turned the truck around. They drove back up the treacherous road, their hearts pounding in their chests. When they reached the clearing, the craft was gone. The forest was dark and silent, and Travis Walton had vanished. They searched frantically, calling his name, their flashlight beams cutting through the trees. But there was no sign of him, no footprints, no torn clothing, nothing. It was as if he had simply ceased to exist. Defeated and terrified, they drove down to Heber and called the Navajo County Sheriff's Office. When Deputy Chuck Ellison arrived, he found 6 grown men, rugged loggers, sitting in a truck, shivering uncontrollably and weeping. Their story was so bizarre, so completely unbelievable, that Ellison initially thought it was a bad joke. But as they retold the events, their consistency and raw, unfiltered terror gave the officers pause. Sheriff Marlon Gillespie arrived and immediately launched a massive search operation. The area was scoured by volunteers, tracking dogs, and even helicopters. But as days passed with no trace of Travis, the authorities' skepticism turned into suspicion. The idea of a UFO abduction was ludicrous. The much more plausible explanation, the police concluded, was murder. The police theorized that a fight had broken out among the crew, resulting in Travis's death, and the UFO story was a wild, desperate cover-up. The men were subjected to intense interrogations and eventually polygraph tests. The results shocked everyone. All 6 men passed the lie detector tests regarding whether they knew where Travis was or if they had harmed him. The examiner concluded they were telling the truth as they believed it. But if they hadn't killed him, where in God's name was Travis Walton? For 5 days, Travis's family endured a living hell. The media descended on the small town of Snowflake, turning the tragedy into a circus. Rumors swirled. Some said it was a hoax to get out of their logging contract. Others believed the murder theory. But on the evening of November 10th, the phone rang in the home of Grant Neff, Travis's brother-in-law. When he answered, a weak, frantic voice on the other end said, "Grant, it's me, Travis. I'm in a phone booth in Heber. Please, come get me." When Grant and Travis's brother Dwayne arrived at the Exxon station in Heber, they found Travis slumped in the phone booth. He was a shell of his former self. He was disheveled, severely dehydrated, and wearing the same light clothing he had on 5 days earlier despite the freezing temperatures. But the most alarming thing was his mental state. He was terrified, hallucinating, flinching at shadows, and mumbling incoherently about beings with massive dark eyes. He believed he had only been gone for a few hours. When they told him he had been missing for 5 days, Travis collapsed. What Travis experienced during those 5 days remains one of the most chilling and detailed accounts of an alleged alien abduction in recorded history. His story did not begin with a beam of light returning him to Earth, but rather with him regaining consciousness in a place that defied all logic. He awoke lying on his back on a cold, flat surface. The air was heavy, humid, and smelled faintly of ozone and damp metal. A harsh, diffused light illuminated the room, though there were no visible light sources. At first, Travis thought he was in a hospital. His chest throbbed with a dull ache where the beam of light had struck him. He tried to sit up, his vision blurry, his muscles screaming in protest. As his eyes slowly adjusted, he realized with a sinking dread that he was not in any hospital he had ever seen. The walls of the room were curved, seamless, and made of a dull gray material that looked like polished steel. There were no windows, no doors, no medical equipment, just the table he was lying on. Then he realized he was not alone. Standing around his table were 3 figures. They were humanoid, but they were unequivocally, terrifyingly not human. They were small, perhaps 5 feet tall, with thin, frail-looking bodies covered in tight-fitting, seamless orange jumpsuits. But it was their faces that etched themselves into Travis's nightmares. Their heads were disproportionately large, hairless, and devoid of ears or a pronounced nose. Their mouths were just tiny slits. But their eyes were massive, dark, luminous orbs that seemed to look right through him. Panic, pure and unadulterated, surged through Travis. He scrambled backward on the table, frantically looking for a weapon, a way out, anything. The beings did not attack him. They simply stood there, staring at him with an unnerving, emotionless intensity. They raised their hands toward him, their small, delicate fingers gesturing in a way that Travis interpreted as an attempt to restrain him. Driven by pure survival instinct, he lashed out. He grabbed a cylindrical, glass-like object from a nearby shelf and swung it wildly at the nearest creature. The object shattered, but the beings didn't fight back. Instead, they simply turned and quickly exited the room through an open doorway that Travis hadn't noticed before. The speed and silence of their retreat were unsettling. Left alone in the room, Travis's heart hammered against his ribs. He knew he had to get out, but he had no idea where he was or what was waiting for him beyond that door. He cautiously stepped out of the examination room and found himself in a narrow, curving hallway. The walls were the same seamless gray metal, and the floor felt strange beneath his feet, slightly spongy and warm. He followed the hallway, his breathing shallow, every muscle tense. He eventually came to another room. This one was different. It was circular, with a high domed ceiling. In the center of the room was a single high-back chair facing a complex array of screens and controls. As Travis stepped into the room, the walls suddenly dissolved. It wasn't that they disappeared, they simply became transparent. He was looking out into the vast, unending expanse of space. Stars burned with a fierce, cold brilliance against the absolute blackness. He could see no familiar constellations, no moon, no earth, just an infinite void. The sheer scale and reality of it hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't just in a strange room, he was in a craft, somewhere in the deep, unfathomable cosmos. Desperate to find a way back, Travis sat in the central chair and began pushing buttons and pulling levers on the console, hoping to steer the craft or send a distress signal. Nothing happened. The screens flickered, displaying incomprehensible symbols and shifting patterns, but the craft did not move. He was a prisoner in a highly advanced machine, hopelessly lost. Just as despair began to consume him, he heard a sound, footsteps. He spun around, expecting the terrifying, large-eyed creatures to return. Instead, a tall figure entered the room. This being looked human. He was muscular, well-proportioned, with fair hair and wearing a tight-fitting bright blue uniform. He wore a transparent helmet over his head. Travis felt a surge of hope. "Where am I? What's going on?" he demanded, rushing toward the man. But the man did not answer. He didn't speak a single word. He simply smiled, a calm, serene, deeply unsettling smile, and gestured for Travis to follow him. Travis, having no other options, followed the silent man out of the room, down a ramp, and into an enormous cavernous space that looked like a hangar. The scale of the place was staggering. It was large enough to house several small aircraft, and the air was thick with the hum of immense machinery. Travis realized he wasn't just on a small scout ship. He was inside a massive mothership, a vessel of unimaginable proportions. The silent man led Travis into another room, where 3 more human-looking beings were waiting, 2 men and 1 woman. They all wore the same blue uniforms, and like the first man, they were silent, calm, and unsettlingly beautiful. Travis begged them for answers. "Who are you, please? Just tell me where I am," he pleaded. The woman stepped forward. She didn't speak, but she reached out and gently placed a small, clear mask over Travis's nose and mouth. Travis tried to resist, to pull the mask away, but the beings held him with surprising, gentle strength. Almost instantly, a thick, heavy lethargy washed over him. The panic drained from his body, replaced by a numbing, suffocating darkness. The faces of the silent, beautiful humans blurred and faded. The last thing Travis Walton remembered before the darkness claimed him completely was the cold, clinical efficiency in their eyes, When he next opened his eyes, he was lying on his back on the cold, hard asphalt. Above him, the night sky of Arizona stretched out, familiar and terrifying. The cold bit into his skin. He heard a high-pitched whine and looked up to see the glowing disk hovering briefly above him before it shot silently into the sky, disappearing among the stars in the blink of an eye. He was alone. He stumbled to his feet, disoriented and freezing, and began the long, agonizing walk toward the lights of Heber, toward the phone booth that would finally reconnect him with the world he thought he had lost forever. The Travis Walton incident remains one of the most polarizing cases in the history of ufology. Skeptics point to the financial pressures the logging crew faced, suggesting the entire event was an elaborate, desperate hoax to break a government contract. They cite the lucrative book deals and movie adaptations as proof of a financial motive. Yet believers point to the polygraph tests passed by all 6 crew members, tests they have taken and passed multiple times over the decades. Regardless of where one stands on the spectrum of belief, the sheer terror described in Travis's account is undeniable. It is a story that preys on our deepest, most primal fears. The fear of the unknown, the fear of losing control, and the terrifying possibility that out there, in the dark, silent expanse of the universe, we are not the apex predators. We are just fragile, temporary things, waiting to be pulled into the light. To truly understand the gravity of the Travis Walton incident, one must look beyond the blinding lights and the terrifying beings inside the craft. The true horror, for the logging crew and for Travis himself, began in the immediate aftermath of his disappearance. When Mike Rogers and his crew fled down the mountain in a blind panic, they weren't just leaving a friend behind. They were stepping into a maelstrom of suspicion, interrogation, and psychological torment that would last for weeks, and in some ways, for the rest of their lives. When the crew finally reached the safety of Snowflake, Arizona, they were in a state of collective shock. They didn't go straight to the police. Instead, they drove aimlessly, trying to rationalize what they had just seen. Was it a military experiment? A hallucination brought on by exhaustion and the freezing cold? But 7 men do not share the exact same hallucination simultaneously. The terror etched on each of their faces was real. When they finally contacted Deputy Chuck Ellison, the sheer absurdity of their story was their greatest liability. The Navajo County Sheriff's Office, led by Sheriff Marlon Gillespie, approached the situation not as a search and rescue operation for an alien abductee, but as a homicide investigation. The logic was cold and inescapable. A man was missing in a rugged, isolated forest. His 6 coworkers claimed he was taken by a flying saucer. To any seasoned investigator, this screamed of a desperate, poorly concocted alibi for murder. The police suspected that a fight had broken out, perhaps over pay, perhaps over something trivial, and Travis had been killed. The UFO story was just a clumsy cover-up. The search operation was massive. Dozens of volunteers, heavily armed police officers, and tracking dogs scoured the Turkey Springs area. They combed the dense underbrush, looking for a body, a shallow grave, or any sign of a struggle. They found nothing. No blood, no torn clothing, no footprints leading away from the site. The dogs, specifically trained to track human scent, behaved erratically at the site where the craft had supposedly hovered, circling in confusion before losing the scent entirely. It was as if Travis had vanished into thin air. The pressure on the 6 loggers was immense. They were interrogated separately, repeatedly, their stories picked apart for inconsistencies. The town of Snowflake turned against them. Whispers in diners and grocery stores painted them as murderers. The media, catching wind of the bizarre story, descended on the town like vultures. Reporters from across the country camped out on the crew's lawns, shoving microphones in their faces, demanding answers. The loggers, simple, working-class men, were completely unequipped to handle the intense scrutiny and the implicit accusations of murder. To clear their names, Mike Rogers and the crew agreed to undergo polygraph testing. This was a critical turning point in the case. The test was administered by Cy Gilson, a highly respected polygraph examiner from the Arizona Department of Public Safety. Gilson asked direct, uncompromising questions. Do you know if Travis Walton is dead? Did you cause physical injury to Travis Walton? Did you see a UFO? The stakes could not have been higher. Failing the test would likely result in murder charges. The results shocked the investigators. Gilson concluded that all 5 men who took the test were telling the truth as they believed it. They had not harmed Travis, they did not know where he was, and they genuinely believed they had seen a UFO. This didn't prove that aliens existed, but it strongly indicated that these men were not murderers. They were traumatized witnesses to an event they could not comprehend. The polygraph results shifted the narrative, forcing the police and the public to confront the impossible. But the skepticism did not die. Philip J. Klass, a prominent aviation journalist and fierce UFO skeptic, launched a relentless campaign to debunk the Walton story. Klass argued that the entire incident was a calculated hoax driven by financial desperation. Mike Rogers' logging contract was behind schedule, and he faced severe financial penalties. Klass theorized that the UFO story was an act of God excuse to break the contract without penalty. He also pointed out that the crew had recently watched a television movie about a UFO abduction, suggesting it provided the inspiration for their lie. Klass's attacks were brutal and deeply personal. He questioned the validity of the polygraph tests, suggesting the loggers had somehow beaten the machine or that Gilson's methodology was flawed. He pointed out inconsistencies in the men's timelines and highlighting their alleged financial motives. The Walton camp fought back, pointing out that Klass had never interviewed the witnesses in person and was cherry-picking evidence to fit his skeptical narrative. The debate became a bitter, entrenched war of words that would continue for decades. When Travis finally reappeared in Heber, 5 days later, the mystery only deepened. His physical condition, dehydrated, disoriented, and significantly thinner, was consistent with someone who had been lost in the wilderness. But he had no exposure injuries, no frostbite, and no signs of having survived in the freezing forest for nearly a week. His account of the inside of the craft, the large-eyed beings, and the human-looking entities only fueled the fire of both believers and skeptics. Travis underwent his own battery of psychological evaluations and polygraph tests. Like his crewmates, he passed. But the trauma of the event and the relentless media circus that followed took a heavy toll. The story was sold to the National Enquirer, which further damaged its credibility in the eyes of many. In 1978, Travis published a book about his experience, The Walton Experience, which was later adapted into the 1993 film Fire in the Sky. The movie, while terrifying, took significant creative liberties with Travis's account of the aliens, depicting them as grotesque monsters rather than the emotionless clinical beings he described. Over the years, the solidarity of the logging crew has been tested. While they maintained their story for decades, the intense pressure and the sheer weirdness of their shared history eventually drove wedges between them. In 2021, Mike Rogers, the crew boss who had driven the truck away that night, publicly distanced himself from the story. He cited personal disputes with Travis and a desire to no longer be defined by the events of November 5, 1975. This fracturing of the crew was seized upon by skeptics as proof that the hoax was finally unraveling. Yet despite the controversies, the debunkers, and the shifting alliances, the core of the story remains unsettlingly intact. 7 men went into the woods. They saw something that terrified them so profoundly they abandoned one of their own. When that man returned, he brought with him a story that challenges our understanding of reality. Whether it was a profound psychological event, a desperate hoax, or a genuine encounter with the unknown, the Travis Walton incident stands as a chilling reminder of how quickly the mundane can descend into absolute suffocating terror.